The delicate clinking of champagne flutes vanished as crystal shattered violently against the marble floor. Victor Sterling, the most ruthless syndicate kingpin on the eastern seaboard, cornered his executive secretary against the shadows of a secluded hallway. His massive frame effectively trapped her, his dark, fathomless eyes burning with a terrifying, possessive wrath. "Enjoying yourself," Victor hissed, his voice as cold as freezing rain. Clara refused to cower. She tilted her head, her green eyes flashing with unbroken, fierce defiance. "I was simply making conversation, Victor. Am I not allowed to smile?" The muscle in his jaw feathered dangerously, the metallic scent of his bleeding hand filling the narrow space. "That man isn't a guest, Clara. He is an undercover federal informant. And if he recognizes the brilliant forensic accountant hiding beneath that secretary disguise, a SWAT team will breach those doors in exactly 10 minutes. How did a disgraced federal prodigy become the most heavily guarded secret of a deadly mafia empire? And what happens when the kingpin realizes his secretary is actually his equal? Subscribe to the channel and listen to the full story right now to find out." The clinking of crystal champagne flutes faded into a dead, terrifying silence as Victor's grip shattered his glass. The sound was sharp, a sudden violent fracture that cut through the low, cultured murmur of the Sterling Syndicate's annual charity gala. Amber liquid and glittering shards rained down onto the pristine marble floor. But Victor Sterling did not look at his bleeding hand. His dark, fathomless eyes were locked with lethal precision across the grand ballroom, fixed entirely on his secretary. For 4 years, Clara Hayes had perfected the art of invisibility. At 41, she had long ago shed the naive illusions of youth, replacing them with the hardened armor of a woman who had survived the absolute destruction of her life. Tonight she wore a high-necked, charcoal gray evening gown that was elegant but intentionally forgettable. Her auburn hair was pinned in a severe, immaculate twist. She was exactly what she was paid to be, a ghost in the machine. The flawless executive assistant who anticipated Victor's needs before he even articulated them, who managed his legitimate front with ruthless efficiency, and who turned a blind eye to the blood that occasionally stained his cuffs. She was supposed to be blending into the opulent wallpaper of the Waldorf Astoria. Instead, she was laughing, a genuine, radiant laugh that reached the corners of her eyes, coaxed out by a devastatingly handsome man in a bespoke tuxedo who had cornered her near the ice sculpture. He had introduced himself as Julian, a venture capitalist with a penchant for dry, self-deprecating humor. For 3 fleeting minutes, Clara had allowed herself to forget the suffocating reality of her existence. She forgot that she was a disgraced forensic accountant, stripped of her license and her dignity by a corrupt district attorney named Robert Gaines. She forgot that she was hiding in the shadow of the city's most dangerous crime boss just to stay out of federal prison. For 3 minutes, she was just Clara, intelligent, witty, and effortlessly charming. Julian leaned in closer, his voice dropping to an intimate murmur as he offered her a fresh glass of Prosecco. Clara smiled, her fingers brushing the stem of the glass. Then, the temperature in the room plummeted. The shift in the atmosphere was absolute and suffocating, like the pressure drop before a catastrophic storm. Clara didn't need to look up to know that Victor was moving. At 48, Victor Sterling moved with the predatory, silent grace of a man who owned the very air he breathed. His presence commanded a primal, involuntary respect from every hardened criminal and corrupt politician in the room. "Excuse me." A voice rumbled from behind Clara, dark and smooth as aged whiskey, lined with razor wire. Julian's easy smile faltered as Victor stepped into their secluded alcove. Victor was a towering figure of immaculate menace in a midnight blue tuxedo, the silver dusting his temples only adding to the aura of a king who had survived 100 wars. He didn't look at Julian. His gaze, hot and heavy, was pinned solely on Clara. "Victor," Clara said, her voice steady, instantly slipping back into the neutral, deferential tone of an employee. I was just making sure the guests were accommodated. Is there an issue with the silent auction? Victor finally shifted his eyes to Julian. The younger man visibly swallowed, his broad shoulders stiffening under the sheer, crushing weight of Victor's scrutiny. The lady is required elsewhere, Victor said softly. It was not a request. It was an execution order for the conversation. Of course. Mr. Sterling. A pleasure. Clara, Julian murmured, hastily retreating into the sea of silk and diamonds, leaving Clara alone in the sudden, freezing vacuum of Victor's presence. Before Clara could ask what was wrong, Victor's hand clamped around her elbow. His grip was entirely inescapable but carefully calibrated not to bruise. Without a word, he guided her away from the glittering ballroom, past the heavy mahogany doors, and down a dimly lit, private service corridor. The music muffled into a distant, rhythmic thumping. He didn't stop until they were entirely alone. Secluded in the shadows where the cameras couldn't see, he backed her against the silk-lined wall, crowding her space, his chest mere inches from hers. Clara's breath caught in her throat. She could smell the expensive, woodsy scent of his cologne, mixed with the metallic tang of fresh blood from the microcuts on his right hand. "Enjoying yourself?" he asked coldly. The words were spoken barely above a whisper, but they echoed in the narrow hallway with deafening force. Clara frowned, her pulse hammering against her ribs, refusing to let the intimidation crack her composure. "I was simply making polite conversation. Victor, it's a charity gala. Mingling is part of the optics." "Mingling," Victor repeated, the word tasting like poison in his mouth. His jaw clenched, a muscle feathering dangerously beneath his skin. He leaned in, placing a heavy hand on the wall right beside her head, effectively caging her in. "You were smiling at him. You were laughing. Is that a violation of my employment contract?" Clara shot back, her own temper flaring. She was a woman in her 40s who had lost everything. She was far past the age of being cowed by an overbearing man, even one who commanded an army of killers. "I apologize if my 3 minutes of humanity disrupted your schedule. I wasn't aware my facial expressions were proprietary." Victor's eyes darkened to pitch. He looked down at her lips, then back up to her defiant eyes. The air between them crackled, thick with 4 years of unspoken tension, of late nights sharing cheap scotch over encrypted ledgers, of lingering glances that had been violently repressed in the name of professionalism. "That man," Victor said, his voice dropping into a guttural rasp, "is Julian Vance. He isn't a venture capitalist. He's an informant working directly for District Attorney Robert Gaines." Clara felt the blood drain from her face. The name Gaines hit her like a physical blow to the stomach. Robert Gaines. The man who had fabricated evidence to frame her for embezzlement. The man who had frozen her bank accounts, publicly humiliated her, and threatened her with 20 years in a maximum security prison simply because she had uncovered his massive money laundering network. He works for Gaines," she whispered, the memory of her destruction threatening to drag her under. "He was fishing, Clara," Victor said, his tone softening imperceptibly as he watched the terror flash through her eyes. He reached out, his thumb lightly brushing the tense line of her jaw, a profoundly intimate gesture that shattered their professional boundaries entirely. "Gaines knows you vanished. He knows you didn't flee the country. Vance was sent here to look for weaknesses in my perimeter. If he had recognized you beneath the makeup and the fake credentials, Gaines would have had a SWAT team kicking down the doors in 10 minutes. Clara closed her eyes, a shudder racking her spine. She had thought she was safe in the shadows of the syndicate. She had thought her disguise was impenetrable. But she had been careless. She had let her guard down for a handsome face and a charming joke. "I'm sorry," she breathed, opening her eyes to meet his. "I didn't know." "You don't have to apologize to me," Victor said fiercely, his hand dropping from the wall to cup her face, his thumb stroking her cheekbone. The jealousy that had radiated from him moments ago was entirely eclipsed by a terrifying, possessive need to protect her. "But I will not watch you smile at a man who is trying to put you in a cage. I will not let them take you." Clara stared up at the most dangerous man in the city, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm. For 4 years, they had played a delicate game of chess. She was the demure secretary, he was the untouchable boss. But in this shadowy hallway, the board had been flipped. The raw, unfiltered emotion in his eyes was undeniable. Yet Clara Hayes was not a damsel in distress. She had survived by her intellect and her resilience. She gently but firmly reached up, wrapping her fingers around his wrist, and pulled his hand away from her face. "Victor," she said, her voice quiet but ringing with absolute steel. "I appreciate the warning, truly. But let's get one thing perfectly clear." She took a small step forward, refusing to be pinned, forcing him to hold his ground. "I sold you my administrative skills. I sold you my discretion. I did not sell you my autonomy. You do not get to dictate who I speak to, how I act, or who I smile at. Just because you pay my salary and keep the wolves at bay." Victor did not flinch. Instead, a slow, deeply appreciative light flickered in his dark eyes. He looked at her not as a subordinate, but as a sovereign entity who had just declared her borders. "You think this is about your salary?" he murmured, the coldness entirely gone from his voice, replaced by a low, simmering heat. "This isn't an employment issue, Clara, it never was." Before she could process the weight of his words, his phone buzzed violently in his inner pocket. The spell broke. Victor stepped back, the mask of the syndicate kingpin sliding flawlessly back over his features. He checked the screen, his expression hardening into granite. "Gaines is moving faster than we anticipated," Victor said, his voice flat and strictly business. "Vance wasn't just here to scout. He was a distraction. Gaines just signed a grand jury subpoena for our shipping manifests. We have less than 24 hours before the DA's office attempts to freeze the syndicate's core assets." Clara instantly shifted gears, the forensic accountant taking over. The fear vanished, replaced by the cold, calculating logic that had once made her the most feared auditor on Wall Street. The shipping manifests won't give them anything unless they can crack the offshore shell companies. And those are encrypted under 3 layers of dummy corporations in the Caymans. "They have a new forensic team," Victor said grimly. "And I have a rat in my inner circle who gave them the routing numbers." He looked at her, his eyes dark with purpose. "The masquerade is over. Clara, no more fetching coffee. No more hiding behind a desk. What are you saying?" "I'm calling an emergency meeting of the capos at dawn," Victor commanded, straightening his cuffs. "I am going to introduce them to the real Clara Hayes. And you are going to show them exactly why Robert Gaines is so terrified of you." A heavy, suffocating silence fell over the Sterling Syndicate's fortified boardroom. The room smelled of aged leather, stale cigar smoke, and the metallic tang of adrenaline. 10 of the most ruthless men in the eastern seaboard sat around a massive oak table, their faces carved from stone and skepticism. These were Victor Sterling's lieutenants, men who ran illegal gambling rings, controlled the docks, and made people vanish without a trace. At the far end of the table sat Marcus Thorne, the syndicate's underboss. Thorne was a man of terrifying, sociopathic ambition. He had dead, shark-like eyes and a smile that never reached them. He viewed human lives as disposable commodities, mere numbers on a spreadsheet to be erased when they were no longer profitable. And standing at the head of the table, directly to Victor Sterling's right, was the clumsy secretary. Clara stood tall, dressed no longer in the demure, oversized cardigans she had used as camouflage for 4 years. She wore a sharply tailored, slate-gray power suit that clung to her formidable posture. Her auburn hair was let down, cascading over her shoulders like dark fire. She held a sleek silver laptop in one hand and a stack of heavily redacted federal files in the other. Thorne leaned back in his leather chair, striking a match and slowly lighting a cigar. He didn't look at Victor. His predatory gaze was fixed entirely on Clara with blatant, insulting amusement. "Is this a joke, Victor?" Thorne asked, blowing a thick cloud of smoke toward the ceiling. "We are facing a massive federal RICO indictment. Gaines is about to freeze 70% of our liquid assets by noon. And you brought the woman who schedules your dental appointments to save us. What is she going to do? Aggressively color code the DA's files. A few of the lower-ranking capos chuckled nervously, their eyes darting between Thorne and Victor. Victor did not sit. He stood with his hands resting flat on the polished oak, projecting an aura of absolute, terrifying control. Marcus, Victor said, his voice smooth and deadly quiet. You have a habit of underestimating the things you do not understand. I suggest you hold your tongue before you sever it entirely. Thorne's smile vanished. The tension in the room ratcheted up, pulling taut like a piano wire. Allow me to introduce you, Victor continued, gesturing to the woman beside him. For 4 years. You have known her as Clara, my executive assistant. Her actual name is Clara Hayes, until 5 years ago. She was the lead forensic auditor for the Federal Financial Crimes Division. She is the woman who single-handedly dismantled the Rossi crime family in Chicago by tracing 50 cents of a laundered parking ticket through a labyrinth of 12 international banks. The room went dead silent. The capos shifted uncomfortably in their seats. They knew that name. Clara Hayes was a ghost story whispered among money launderers, a legendary apex predator of the financial world. She was brilliant, Victor said, his eyes scanning the room, daring anyone to object. So brilliant that when she accidentally uncovered DA Robert Gaines's personal money laundering operation, Gaines panicked. He used the full power of his office to fabricate evidence, frame her for embezzlement, and destroy her life to keep her quiet. I intercepted her before she could be arrested. She has been managing our books in the shadows ever since. Thorne leaned forward, his elbows resting on the table. The cigar smoke curled around his face like a venomous snake. He wasn't impressed. He was threatened. A woman with this level of intelligence, operating this close to Victor, was a variable he could not control. And Marcus Thorne hated things he could not control. So she's a disgraced Fed, Thorne sneered, his voice dripping with condescension. A broken little bird who couldn't even protect herself from a two-bit politician like Gaines. And now she's supposed to protect our empire. She's a liability. Victor, if the feds find out we're harboring a fugitive, they won't just freeze our assets. They'll drone strike this building. She is commodity we cannot afford. Clara did not flinch. She had spent the last 5 years being crushed by the weight of arrogant, powerful men who thought they could dictate her worth. She had been humiliated, stripped of her career, and forced to cower in the shadows. But she was done cowering. Before Victor could intervene, Thorne moved. With a flick of his wrist, a 6-inch combat knife materialized in his hand. He slammed the blade down violently, burying the steel deep into the polished oak table, mere inches from Clara's laptop. The heavy thud echoed in the silent room. In our world, sweetheart, Thorne whispered, his eyes locking onto hers with psychotic intensity. Respect isn't earned with calculators and spreadsheets. It's earned with blood. You don't belong here. Go back to making the coffee before you get hurt. Victor's hands twitched toward the holster beneath his jacket, his eyes flashing with a murderous rage that promised immediate, violent death for Thorne. But Clara reached out and gently laid her hand over Victor's arm, silently commanding him to stop. Victor froze, looking down at her, astonished by her absolute calm. Clara slowly turned her attention back to Thorne. She didn't look at the knife vibrating in the wood. She looked at the man holding it, her expression one of utter, freezing boredom. Mr. Thorne, Clara said, her voice clear, authoritative, and completely devoid of fear. You are under the tragic misconception that violence is power. It isn't. Violence is loud, messy, and fundamentally inefficient. She reached out, opened her laptop, and tapped a sequence of keys. The massive projector screen at the end of the boardroom hummed to life, casting a stark, blue light over the faces of the syndicate bosses. For the past 4 years, I haven't just been managing Mr. Sterling's schedule, Clara said, her fingers flying across the keyboard with the speed and precision of a virtuoso pianist. I have been mapping the entire financial circulatory system of this syndicate. including the off-the-books accounts that certain underbosses have been keeping hidden from their king. Thorne's face lost a fraction of its color. "What the hell are you doing?" he demanded. "Standing up. You see, Marcus," Clara continued. Her eyes locked on the screen as lines of complex code and banking terminal interfaces scrolled rapidly. "I noticed a discrepancy in the dockyard revenues 6 months ago. A leak. It took me a while to trace it. Considering you used military-grade encryption and routed the stolen funds through a series of shell companies in Zurich and the Cayman Islands." The projection screen snapped to a highly classified banking dashboard. In the center of the screen, a massive number glowed in bright white font, 42,500,000. Whispers broke out among the capos. $42 million. It was a staggering sum, embezzled directly from the syndicate's operational budget. "You're lying." Thorne spat, though a bead of sweat suddenly materialized on his temple. "That's fabricated data. You framed me, just like Gaines framed you." Clara finally stopped typing. She rested her hands on the table and looked directly into Thorne's panicked eyes. "I am a forensic accountant, Mr. Thorne," she said, her voice dropping to a deadly, commanding whisper. "I don't frame people. I just illuminate the truth." She reached over and pressed the enter key with a single, deliberate strike. The heavy silence in the boardroom was broken only by the rapid, cascading digital chime of the banking terminal. On the massive screen, the number 42500 flashed red. Then it began to drop, fast, 30,000, 15,000, 20,000, 00. The screen flashed a final message. "Transfer complete. Account closed." Thorne staggered back as if he had been physically shot. He looked at the screen, then at Clara, his mouth opening and closing in mute, absolute horror. His secret empire, his exit strategy, his entire life's work of betrayal, wiped out in under 12 seconds. "I just bypassed your military-grade encryption, emptied your offshore accounts, and dispersed the $42 million into 3,000 separate, untraceable charitable trusts benefiting the public school system of New York," Clara stated, closing her laptop with a soft, final click. "You are entirely bankrupt, Marcus. You couldn't afford to buy a cup of coffee right now, let alone a mercenary army to challenge Mr. Sterling." She stepped away from the table, pulling Thorne's combat knife effortlessly out of the wood. She casually tossed it onto the table, where it clattered harmlessly against the mahogany. "A person's worth isn't measured by the caliber of their weapon, or how loud they can shout in a room full of men," Clara said, her voice echoing with profound authority, lecturing the entire room. "It is measured by the weight of their mind and the strength of their integrity. You treated me as a commodity. You viewed human dignity as a weakness. Disrespecting people, Mr. Thorne, is fundamentally bad for business." The silence that followed was absolute. The capos stared at Clara, not with the condescension they had shown 5 minutes ago, but with sheer, unadulterated terror. She hadn't fired a single shot, yet she had completely destroyed the second most powerful man in the room without breaking a sweat. Victor Sterling stood at the head of the table. He was not looking at Thorne. He was looking at Clara, the pride, the respect, and the intense, burning admiration in his eyes were unmistakable. For years, he had been a king surrounded by wolves, constantly fighting to maintain dominance. But looking at Clara, he realized he had not just found a weapon to defeat the district attorney. He had found his equal. "Marcus," Victor said, breaking the silence. His voice was calm, but it carried a lethal promise. "You have stolen from this family. You have insulted my most trusted advisor. The only reason you are leaving this room breathing is because Clara has already taken everything that matters to you." Victor gestured to the two massive enforcers standing by the door. "Remove him. Strip him of his territory. If I see his face in this city again, I won't need an accountant to deal with him." Thorne was dragged out of the room, shouting obscenities, a broken, bankrupt man. When the heavy doors slammed shut, Victor turned his attention back to the stunned capos. The district attorney thinks we are vulnerable, Victor announced, his presence dominating the space. He thinks he can use the law to crush us while lining his own pockets. But Gaines made a fatal error. He left his greatest enemy alive. Victor gestured to Clara. Ms. Hayes is taking full operational control of our financial counteroffensive. We are going to bleed Robert Gaines dry. We are going to find his ledgers, expose his corruption, and let the federal government tear him apart. Anyone who disrespects her authority will answer to me personally. Are we clear? A chorus of rapid, respectful nods swept around the table. Crystal clear, boss, one of the older capos murmured, eyeing Clara with deep reverence. Meeting adjourned, Victor said, as the men filed out of the room. The adrenaline that had been keeping Clara upright began to fade. Her hands trembled slightly as she packed her laptop into her leather briefcase. She had just declared war on a corrupt district attorney and publicly humiliated a sociopathic mobster. There was no going back to the shadows now. She was in the crosshairs. Are you all right? Clara looked up. Victor was standing close, the space between them suddenly feeling incredibly small. The cold kingpin who had just banished his underboss was gone, replaced by a man looking at her with quiet, profound vulnerability. I'm fine, Clara lied, her voice shaking slightly. Just processing. Victor reached out, his large, warm hands gently gripping her shoulders. The touch grounded her, sending a wave of heat through her chest. What you did today, Clara, he murmured, his eyes searching hers. I have never seen anyone command a room like that. You didn't just break him. You redefined the power dynamic of my entire organization. I told you last night, Victor, Clara said, looking up into his dark eyes, finding a strange, terrifying comfort in them. I'm not a victim to be protected, and I won't be treated like property. I know, Victor said softly. He stepped closer, eliminating the remaining distance between them, his thumbs lightly tracing her collarbones. I don't buy people. Clara, slavery is a sin of weak men. I don't want a subordinate. I don't want a secretary. He paused, his gaze dropping to her lips before meeting her eyes with burning sincerity. I want a partner, an equal. In every sense of the word. If you're willing to stand by me in this war. Clara looked at the man holding her. She saw the danger in his life, the violence that surrounded him, but she also saw the unyielding respect in his eyes, the absolute recognition of her humanity and her brilliance. For the first time in 5 years, Clara Hayes didn't feel broken. She felt powerful. She felt seen. I'm with you, Victor, Clara whispered, her hands coming up to rest flat against his chest, feeling the steady, powerful beat of his heart. Let's burn Robert Gaines to the ground. The cool, heavy weight of the titanium flash drive pressed into Clara's palm, anchoring her to a reality she had spent the last 5 years believing was entirely lost. The server room of the Sterling Syndicate was a cathedral of blinking blue lights and the low, constant hum of massive cooling fans. It was a stark contrast to the opulence of the world above, but to Clara, it was a sanctuary of undeniable truth. She stared at the small silver device, her thumb tracing its smooth edge. Inside that drive was the definitive, irrefutable digital footprint of District Attorney Robert Gaines. It contained the exact routing numbers, the encrypted offshore ledger entries, and the time-stamped authorization codes, proving that Gaines had orchestrated the $40 million embezzlement scheme and meticulously framed her to take the fall. It was her innocence, crystallized into 4 gigabytes of data, for 3 sleepless weeks. Clara had lived in this subterranean fortress. She had weaponized Victor's vast shadow network servers to run a brute force decryption algorithm on the Cayman Island shell companies Gaines used to hide his wealth. She had subsisted on black coffee and sheer, unadulterated vengeance. Now the hunt was over. The ghost in the machine had caught the predator. The heavy steel door of the server room hissed open. The rhythmic, commanding footsteps that followed could only belong to one man. Victor Sterling stepped into the cool, artificial light, shedding his tailored suit jacket and draping it over the back of a leather chair. He wore a crisp white dress shirt with the sleeves rolled up to his forearms, revealing the faint, silver scars of a life lived on the bleeding edge of violence. His dark eyes immediately locked onto Clara, sweeping over the dark circles under her eyes and the triumphant, albeit exhausted, set of her shoulders. "You found it," Victor said, his voice a low, resonant rumble that vibrated through the quiet room. It wasn't a question. He knew her capabilities too well to doubt the outcome. Every single cent. Clara breathed, turning to face him. She held up the flash drive, the blue lights catching the metal. He routed the money through a dummy corporation registered to his late mother's maiden name in Belize, then washed it through a series of commercial real estate holdings in Manhattan. "I have the wire transfers. I have the IP addresses that match his personal terminal at the DA's office. It's a flawless paper trail. When this hits the Department of Justice, Robert Gaines won't just be disbarred. He will face federal prison." Victor stepped closer, stopping mere inches from her. The proximity between them had become a living, breathing entity over the past 3 weeks, a magnetic pull that both of them fiercely acknowledged but carefully restrained. He looked down at the flash drive, then up into her eyes. There was a profound, bittersweet pride in his gaze, mixed with a heavy sorrow he was fighting desperately to conceal. "You did it, Clara," Victor murmured. He reached into his inner pocket and withdrew a thick, sealed manila envelope, holding it out to her, and as promised, "I have done my part." Clara looked at the envelope, her brow furrowing in confusion. "What is this?" "Your emancipation," Victor replied softly. "Inside is a newly minted, federally authenticated passport under the name Clara Vance. There is a deed to a property in Geneva, Switzerland, and the access codes to a numbered account containing $5 million of untraceable, legitimate funds. The private jet at Teterboro is fueled and waiting on the tarmac. It departs in exactly 2 hours." Clara's breath hitched in her throat. She stared at the envelope as if it were a live grenade. For 4 years, she had dreamed of nothing but freedom. She had dreamed of walking out of the shadows, of shedding the terrifying proximity to the criminal underworld, of breathing clean air without the constant, suffocating fear of the FBI kicking down her door. Victor was handing her the world on a silver platter. He was giving her her life back. But as she looked up into Victor's face, she realized the devastating cost of that freedom. "You're sending me away," Clara whispered, a sudden, inexplicable ache blooming in her chest. Victor's jaw tightened, the muscle feathering violently beneath his skin. He reached out, his large, warm hands gently gripping her shoulders. "I am setting you free, Clara," he corrected, his voice thick with a raw, suppressed emotion. "You came to me because you were drowning. I offered you a golden cage because it was the only way to keep the wolves from tearing you apart, but it is still a cage. You are a brilliant, honorable woman. You do not belong in my world of blood and shadows. You deserve the sunlight. And what if I don't want to leave?" Clara challenged, her voice trembling as she stepped into his space, refusing to look away. The memory of his hands on her face in the hallway of the Waldorf Astoria, the fierce, protective fire in his eyes, burned brightly in her mind. "What if the sunlight isn't worth anything if I have to stand in it alone?" Victor closed his eyes, a ragged breath escaping his lungs. The self-control required to push her away was visibly tearing him apart. When he opened his eyes again, they were completely stripped of the ruthless mob boss persona. He was just a man, looking at the only woman who had ever truly seen his soul. "If you stay," Victor whispered, his hand sliding up to cup her face, his thumbs gently tracing her cheekbones. "You will never truly be safe. The syndicate is a war that never ends. You will always be a target. I cannot, and I will not, allow the woman I love to become collateral damage in a life she never asked for. I respect your autonomy. Clara, I respect it enough to let you walk out that door while you still can." The confession hung in the air between them, heavy and devastating. The woman I love. It was the truth they had danced around, The silent vow that had fueled his protective rage against Julian Vance and Marcus Thorne. Clara's eyes filled with hot tears. She reached up, placing her hands over his, leaning her face into his warm palms. "Victor, take the envelope." "Clara," he pleaded, his voice breaking. He leaned down, resting his forehead against hers. They stood there in the quiet hum of the server room, sharing a moment of profound, shattering intimacy. It was a goodbye spoken in the language of shared breath and broken hearts. Send the data to the feds from Geneva. Let them destroy Gaines. Reclaim your life. Be free. Clara knew he was right. Staying meant embracing the violence, the constant paranoia, the moral gray area that she had spent her life fighting against. With a trembling hand, she took the manila envelope. Victor pulled back, his mask of stoic control sliding back into place. Though his eyes remained dark with grief, he stepped aside, clearing the path to the heavy steel door. "My men will escort you to the airstrip. Do not look back. Clara, for both our sakes." Claire turned and walked toward the exit, the flash drive in one hand and her new life in the other. She pushed open the heavy door, not daring to look back, knowing that if she saw his face one more time, she would drop the envelope and never leave his side. She took the private elevator up to the ground floor of the commercial skyscraper that served as the syndicate's legitimate front. The massive glass doors of the lobby slid open, welcoming her into the bustling, chaotic heartbeat of New York City. The late morning sun hit her face, warm and blinding. The air smelled of exhaust fumes, roasting nuts, and rain. It was the smell of freedom. She had the proof. She had a new identity. She was finally, truly safe. Clara took one step onto the bustling sidewalk, raising her hand to hail a cab to Teterboro. The screeching of tires drowned out the city noise. 3 unmarked. Black Chevrolet Suburbans jumped the curb, their heavy tires violently mounting the concrete. Pedestrians screamed and scattered as the massive vehicles boxed Clara in against the glass facade of the building in a flawless, military-style tactical blockade. Before Clara could even register the threat, the doors of the vehicles slammed open. A dozen men poured out into the sunlight. They were not wearing the tailored suits of syndicate enforcers. They wore tactical vests, windbreakers emblazoned with the bold yellow letters of the FBI, and they were leveling assault rifles directly at her chest. Federal agents. "Put your hands in the air. Do it now." Clara froze, the manila envelope slipping from her numb fingers, scattering the Swiss passport and the banking documents across the dirty pavement. The titanium flash drive felt like a lead weight in her hand. The illusion of safety shattered into a million jagged pieces. The sunlight she had craved so desperately was suddenly cold, exposing her to the absolute worst nightmare imaginable. Stepping out from behind the wall of armed federal agents was a tall man in a meticulously tailored charcoal suit. His silver hair was slicked back, and his face bore a look of smug, predatory triumph. District Attorney Robert Gaines. Gaines walked slowly toward her, his polished shoes crunching over the scattered papers of her false identity. He looked at the flash drive in her trembling hand, his smile widening into a terrifying smirk. "Hello, Clara," Gaines said smoothly, his voice cutting through the chaos. "I hear you've been looking for me." The cold, unforgiving steel of the heavy handcuffs ratcheted tightly around Clara's wrists, biting deep into her skin. The physical pain was a distant, muted echo compared to the absolute psychological devastation ripping through her mind. She was thrown roughly against the hood of the Central Suburban, the hot metal searing through the thin fabric of her blouse. The street was a blur of flashing red and blue lights, the screaming sirens drowning out the frantic questions of the gathering crowd. "Clara Hayes," the arresting federal agent barked, aggressively patting her down and snatching the titanium flash drive from her clenched fist. "You are under arrest for federal embezzlement, wire fraud, flight to avoid prosecution, and conspiracy to commit racketeering. You have the right to remain silent." The Miranda warning washed over her like static. She couldn't breathe. The panic was a physical weight crushing her chest. How did he know? How did he find her the exact second she stepped out of Victor's protection? Gaines approached the hood of the car, casually holding up a clear plastic evidence bag. The agent dropped her titanium flash drive into it. Gaines zipped the bag shut, tapping the plastic with a manicured fingernail. "You always were too smart for your own good, Clara," Gaines murmured, leaning in close so only she could hear him over the sirens. His breath smelled of expensive peppermint and stale coffee. "Did you really think a woman who vanished into thin air for 4 years could suddenly start pinging offshore banking servers in the Caymans without triggering an alarm? I didn't need to find you. I just had to wait for you to try and find me." Clara was violently shoved into the back of the armored SUV, the heavy door slamming shut and sealing her in the claustrophobic, caged darkness of the transport vehicle. As the motorcade sped away from the syndicate's headquarters, Clara stared at the metal grating separating her from the driver, her mind spinning wildly. She had used Victor's servers. She had utilized the most sophisticated, encrypted network on the eastern seaboard to bypass Gaines' security. She thought she was being invisible, but in doing so, she had tripped a digital tripwire. Gaines hadn't tracked her physical location. He had tracked the origin of the decryption algorithm. They did not take her to a standard police precinct. The motorcade bypassed the city center entirely, pulling into the heavily fortified subterranean garage of the Federal Detention Center in Brooklyn. She was hauled out of the vehicle, stripped of her elegant clothes, and forced into a coarse, oversized orange jumpsuit. They took her fingerprints, photographed her exhausted, terrified face, and threw her into a windowless concrete interrogation room. The room was freezing. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed with an irritating, relentless hum. Clara sat handcuffed to the steel table bolted to the floor, shivering uncontrollably. The adrenaline had completely evaporated, leaving behind a hollow, agonizing void of despair. She thought of Victor. She thought of the pain in his eyes when he told her to leave. He had given up the woman he loved to protect her, and she had walked straight into a federal trap. The heavy metal door groaned open. District Attorney Robert Gaines walked in, carrying a thick file folder. He didn't bring a detective or a federal agent with him. He wanted this victory so entirely private. He pulled out the metal chair opposite her and sat down, dropping the file onto the table with a loud, theatrical thud. "I must admit," Clara Gaines began, leaning back and steepling his fingers. "When my cybersecurity team alerted me that someone was brute forcing their way into my late mother's trust accounts, I assumed it was the Russians, or perhaps a rival cartel. Imagine my absolute delight when the IP address traced back to a server farm owned by the Sterling Syndicate, and the keystroke signature matched a disgraced forensic accountant who vanished 4 years ago. The evidence is on that drive," Clara said, her voice hoarse, fighting to keep the tremor out of her words. "You can arrest me, Robert, but that drive proves you stole the 40 million. It proves you framed me. The FBI has it now. You are digging your own grave." Gaines let out a slow, chilling laugh. He reached into his suit pocket, pulled out the clear plastic evidence bag containing her flash drive, and placed it on the table. "This drive?" Gaines asked, feigning innocence. "The one seized during the arrest of a known fugitive." "My dear Clara, the FBI hasn't seen the contents of this drive, and they never will. As the presiding district attorney on this task force, I have already classified this device as corrupted evidence, planted by the Sterling Syndicate to discredit a public official. It will be destroyed in an incinerator by midnight." Clara stared at the plastic bag, the blood roaring in her ears. Her salvation, her truth, her entire ticket to freedom erased with a simple bureaucratic lie. The system wasn't just broken. It was actively weaponized by the corrupt men who controlled it. But that's not even the best part, Gaines continued, leaning forward, his eyes gleaming with malicious intent. He opened the thick file folder and slid a stark white document across the steel table. "I didn't just arrest you on your old embezzlement charges, Clara. Those were small potatoes. A twee sentence at best. With good behavior, You might have seen sunlight by the time you were 60. Clara looked down at the document. The bold black letters at the top of the page seemed to burn into her retinas. United States versus Clara Hayes indictment under the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations RICO Act. You used Victor Sterling's servers. Gaines whispered, his voice dripping with venomous satisfaction. You lived in his properties. You managed his legitimate fronts. You are legally, inextricably tied to the most powerful organized syndicate on the eastern seaboard. Under the RICO Act, you are not just an accessory. Clara, you are a co-conspirator to every murder, every extortion, and every drug shipment the Sterling Syndicate has executed in the last 4 years. The room started to spin. Clara couldn't breathe. The air felt thick, heavy, suffocating. By trying to prove your innocence using Sterling's assets, you literally signed your own federal death warrant. Gaines stated, leaning back and crossing his arms. The RICO charges carry a mandatory life sentence in a federal supermax facility. No parole, no early release. You will die in a concrete box. Clara, I am not a mobster. Clara choked out, tears of absolute, crushing defeat spilling over her eyelashes. I was just trying to survive. I was trying to expose you. And you failed. Gaines said coldly, justice is not a blindfolded woman holding scales, Clara. It is a predator holding a price tag. And you simply couldn't afford the cost of admission. He stood up, buttoning his suit jacket with meticulous care. He looked down at her, not with anger, but with the terrifying apathy of a man stepping on an insect. I am going to offer you one deal, and one deal only, Gaines said, picking up the evidence bag containing the flash drive. You are going to testify in federal court that Victor Sterling forced you to hack my accounts to frame me. You will take the stand, and you will give me the internal structure of his syndicate. You will hand me Victor Sterling's head on a silver platter. If you do that, I will drop the RICO charges. And you can serve your original 20 years in a minimum security facility. Clara looked up at him through her tears. The image of Victor standing in the server room, begging her to take her freedom, begging her to be safe, flashed in her mind. Victor, who had treated her with more dignity, respect, and humanity than the entire United States justice system combined. I will never testify against him, Clara said, her voice shaking, but her resolve hardening into something sharp and unbreakable. I will rot in hell before I help you destroy the only honorable man in this city. Gaines' smile vanished, replaced by a mask of cruel, calculating fury. Suit yourself, he spat. Enjoy the concrete. Clara, it's the only thing you're going to touch for the rest of your natural life. He turned and walked out, the heavy metal door slamming shut behind him with a final, echoing boom. The deadbolt slid into place with a sickening mechanical click. 2 female guards entered moments later. They dragged Clara up from the chair by her arms and hauled her out of the interrogation room. They marched her down a long, sterile corridor lined with solid steel doors. The sound of wheat and screaming echoing from the bowels of the prison. They stopped in front of cell 4B. The door slid open, revealing a microscopic, windowless box containing a thin mattress on a steel slab and a stainless steel toilet. They shoved her inside. The door slammed shut, cutting off the light from the hallway. Clara collapsed onto the cold concrete floor, pulling her knees to her chest. The darkness was absolute. The silence was deafening. The realization of her total helplessness crashed over her like a tidal wave. She had fought so hard. She had used every ounce of her intellect, her resilience, and her courage to reclaim her dignity. She had brought a mafia underboss to his knees without firing a shot. She had found the irrefutable truth of her innocence, and it meant absolutely nothing. The law did not care about the truth. The law cared about power, and Robert Gaines held all the cards. She was entirely stripped of her agency, her hope, and her future. She had traded the luxurious, fiercely protected golden cage of Victor Sterling's empire for a freezing concrete tomb. Laying her cheek against the freezing floor, Clara Hayes closed her eyes, and for the first time in 5 years, the brilliant, unbroken forensic accountant finally shattered. She wept the sound of her profound, utter despair swallowed completely by the unforgiving walls of the federal holding cell. Time inside the federal holding cell did not pass. It stagnated, without a window, a clock, or the ambient noise of the city. Clara Hayes was left adrift in an ocean of freezing, suffocating sensory deprivation. The harsh fluorescent light embedded in the concrete ceiling never flickered, burning into her retinas until she was forced to bury her face in her hands. The thin, abrasive fabric of the orange jumpsuit offered no protection against the bone-chilling dampness of the floor. She did not know if she had been sitting in the corner for 3 hours or 3 days. Her mind, usually a brilliant, high-functioning engine of logic and numbers, had collapsed in on itself. The walls seemed to be inching closer, threatening to crush the last remaining breath from her lungs. She had fought the system with everything she had, only to discover that the system was merely a tool wielded by monsters. The sudden, jarring metallic scrape of the heavy deadbolt sliding back echoed like a gunshot in the tiny cell. Clara flinched, pulling her knees tighter to her chest as the heavy steel door groaned outward. The corridor light spilled into the darkness, casting the long, distorted silhouettes of 2 men. They were not wearing the standard blue uniforms of federal corrections officers. They wore unmarked black tactical gear, their faces concealed behind dark balaclavas. There were no badges. There were no name tags. "Get up," the larger of the 2 men growled, his voice muffled through the thick fabric of his mask. Clara's heart hammered against her ribs, a primal surge of adrenaline piercing through her exhaustion. "Where is my lawyer?" she demanded, her voice hoarse and trembling, yet laced with the defiant remnants of her dignity. "I have not been arraigned. You cannot transfer me without a logged judicial order." The men did not answer. They stepped into the cell with terrifying, practiced synchronization. Before Clara could scramble backward, rough hands grabbed her by the shoulders, hauling her violently to her feet. She struggled, kicking out, but she was exhausted and entirely overpowered. A heavy coarse canvas hood was shoved down over her head, plunging her back into absolute, suffocating darkness. Thick plastic zip ties were wrapped around her wrists, pulling them behind her back with enough force to bite deeply into her skin and cut off the circulation. "Walk," the man ordered, shoving her forward, blind, bound, and terrified. Clara was marched out of the cell. She lost her footing twice, only to be dragged upward by the collar of her jumpsuit. The air shifted around her, moving from the stale, antiseptic chill of the prison block to the damp, exhaust-choked atmosphere of a subterranean parking garage. The hollow echo of their footsteps was replaced by the sliding of a heavy metal van door. She was shoved inside, falling hard onto the ribbed metal floor of a transport vehicle. The door slammed shut with a definitive, ringing finality. The engine roared to life, and the van lurched forward, throwing her against the cold steel wall. The journey was a nightmare of disorienting turns, sudden stops, and the overwhelming scent of cheap gasoline and old blood deeply ingrained in the floorboards. Clara lay on her side in the pitch black, her breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps. Who had taken her? Was it Gaines? Was he transferring her to a black site to torture the syndicate's secrets out of her? Or had Victor somehow found out she was arrested and sent his men to extract her? The thought of Victor brought a sharp, agonizing ache to her chest. She remembered the fierce, heartbreaking look in his eyes when he handed her the passport. He had loved her enough to let her go. He had tried to save her. And she had ruined it all by stepping out into the sunlight. The van finally ground to a halt. The back doors swung open, letting in a rush of freezing, salt-heavy air. She could hear the distant cry of seagulls and the rhythmic, hollow slapping of water against wooden pilings. They were at the docks, an abandoned harbor front. Clara was dragged out of the van and pulled up a flight of echoing metal stairs. The air inside the new structure smelled of rust, decaying wood, and damp concrete. It was a massive, empty warehouse. the sheer size of it evident by the way the footsteps of her captors bounced off the distant walls. She was forced into a hard, wooden chair. Someone grabbed her zip-tied hands and roughly secured them to the chair's backing with a thick coil of rope. The canvas hood was violently yanked from her head. Clara gasped, blinking rapidly against the sudden, blinding glare of a single, high-intensity halogen work light suspended directly above her. She squinted through the burning in her eyes, trying to make out the shapes in the suffocating shadows beyond the light's reach. The two men in tactical gear stepped back, melting into the darkness. From the periphery of the light, a figure slowly stepped forward. The rhythmic, agonizingly slow click of his leather shoes on the concrete floor sent a spike of pure, unadulterated terror straight through Clara's spine. Well, 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 a smooth, venomous voice echoed in the cavernous space. Look at what the federal tide dragged in. Marcus Thorne walked into the halo of the halogen light. He was no longer wearing the immaculate, $10,000 tailored suits he favored during syndicate board meetings. He wore a dark trench coat over a wrinkled shirt. His face was drawn, his eyes sunken and bloodshot, practically vibrating with a frantic, unhinged energy. Clara had bankrupted him. She had humiliated him in front of the entire criminal underworld. And now, the sociopathic underboss was looking at her with a smile that promised absolute, prolonged agony. Marcus, Clara breathed, the blood draining entirely from her face. In the flesh, sweetheart. Thorne sneered, pulling up a rusted metal folding chair and sitting directly in front of her. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, his dead, shark-like eyes drinking in her battered, helpless state. I have to admit, when Gaines called me and told me he had you in a federal holding cell, I didn't believe it. The great Clara Hayes, the untouchable forensic genius who stole $42 million from me with a single keystroke, sitting in a cage, crying over a RICO charge. Clara's mind raced, trying to put the pieces together. Gaines called you. You're working with the district attorney. Thorne laughed, a dry rasping sound that lacked any real humor. Politics makes for strange bedfellows. Clara, Gaines wants to be the governor of New York. To do that, he needs the biggest mafia bust of the decade. He needs Victor Sterling's head on a spike. And well, thanks to your little parlor trick with my offshore accounts, I need a new empire. So, Gaines struck a mutually beneficial arrangement. He looks the other way while I orchestrate a coup to remove Victor. I take over the syndicate. I feed Gaines a few rival cartels to boost his poll numbers. And everyone wins. You can't overthrow Victor, Clara said, her voice shaking but her logic desperately holding firm. His men are loyal to him. They will never follow a bankrupt, exiled traitor. Oh, they will, Thorne whispered, his smile widening into something truly monstrous. Because Victor isn't the invincible god you think he is. He has a fatal flaw, a glaring, pathetic weakness that has completely compromised his judgment. Thorne reached out, grabbing her chin with vicious, bruising force, forcing her to look directly into his manic eyes. You, Clara tried to pull away, but his grip was iron. Victor went insane when you were arrested, Thorne said, his voice dropping to a theatrical whisper. He started tearing the city apart. He demanded the capos mobilize every armed man we have to assault the federal detention center. It was suicide. The capos saw it. They saw that their king was willing to burn his entire empire to the ground, to send hundreds of loyal men to their deaths, all for a secretary. Thorne let go of her chin, wiping his hand on his coat in mock disgust. So, when I approached them with a sensible alternative, they listened. A quiet coup. A change in leadership to restore order. Victor will kill you, Clara said, tears of defiance burning in her eyes. He will find this place, and he will kill you. Victor, Thorne said, leaning back and pulling a small, sleek digital audio player from his coat pocket, is a businessman. Clara, when the capos turned their guns on him, when he realized he was cornered, stripped of his power, and facing a mutiny he couldn't survive. He did exactly what men like him always do. He negotiated. Clara froze. The breath trapped itself in her lungs. No, no, he wouldn't. He realized you were a sunk cost. Thorne continued, his voice dripping with sadistic glee. He pressed a button on the side of the audio player. A small green light blinked to life. Gaines offered him a deal through me. Victor gets to keep his life and a small fraction of his legitimate shipping businesses, provided he steps down and officially hands you over to the DA's office to take the fall for the RICO charges. No rescue missions, no retaliation. You're lying, Clara whispered, shaking her head frantically. He wouldn't do that. He told me he loved me. He let me go. Love, Thorne scoffed, rolling his eyes. In our world, love is just leverage. Listen for yourself. Thorne placed the digital audio player on the concrete floor, directly beneath the halogen light, and pressed play. The audio crackled for a fraction of a second before the voices came through with crystal clear fidelity. The capos are standing down. Victor, it's over. You have no moves left. It was Thorne's voice on the recording, sounding authoritative and calm. A heavy, tense silence followed, and then the second voice spoke. What are Gaines' terms? Clara's heart stopped. The world around her tilted violently on its axis. It was Victor. It was his exact, unmistakable baritone. It had the identical gravelly resonance, the precise, measured cadence, the slight, aristocratic inflection he used when he was negotiating a hostile takeover. Gaines wants the Hayes woman, Thorne's recorded voice replied. He needs a scapegoat for the RICO indictments. You sign the internal transfer of power to me. You stand down your personal guard, and you disavow any connection to her. In exchange, Gaines unfreezes your legitimate port authorities, and you get to walk away with your life. Another agonizing pause on the tape. Clara stared at the glowing green light of the audio player, tears streaming down her face, silently begging the recorded voice to fight, to scream, to refuse. She's a liability, Victor's voice said smoothly, stripped entirely of emotion, ringing with a cold, terrifying apathy. She accomplished what I needed with the accounts, but she was careless. If Gaines wants her, let him have her. Draft the transfer papers. Marcus, I'm done with her. The recording clicked off. The silence that rushed back into the warehouse was absolute, broken only by the sound of Clara's ragged, hyperventilating sobs. The psychological devastation was instantaneous and complete. The words struck her with the physical force of a sledgehammer to the chest, shattering every defense, every ounce of hope. Every fragile piece of trust she had painstakingly rebuilt over the last 4 years. The recording was flawless. There was no static, no awkward splicing, no robotic undertones. It was Victor, the man who had touched her face with such reverence, the man who had promised her freedom, had calculated her worth, and traded her life for his shipping ports. Marcus Thorne stood up, kicking the audio player aside. He looked down at the broken, weeping woman strapped to the chair, his face a mask of supreme, victorious cruelty. You see, Clara, Thorne whispered, walking in a slow circle around her. You thought you were a player in this game. You thought because you could read a ledger and type fast, you were his equal. But you were never anything more than a pawn, a temporary distraction. When the board was tipped, the king sacrificed the pawn to save himself. Clara squeezed her eyes shut, unable to breathe through the crushing, agonizing weight of her heartbreak. The physical torture Thorne could inflict upon her meant nothing anymore. Her spirit was entirely pulverized. The deepfake AI audio clone had achieved what no bullet ever could. It had destroyed her soul. She slumped forward against the ropes, her auburn hair falling over her face, obscuring the tears that fell hot and fast onto the cold concrete. She was utterly alone, abandoned in the dark, waiting for the monsters to finally finish her off. She surrendered to the darkness. She didn't want to fight anymore. She just wanted it to end. Miles Davis's Blue and Green played softly from a vintage analog turntable. The melancholy, muted trumpet notes drifting like smoke through the sprawling, opulent expanse of Victor Sterling's penthouse. The floor-to-ceiling windows offered a breathtaking, panoramic view of the Manhattan skyline. A glittering sea of diamonds set against a starless night sky. The luxury of the room, the imported Italian leather sofas, the abstract expressionist paintings, the crystal decanters of priceless scotch was absolute. It was a beautiful room, and it was currently serving as an execution chamber. Victor Sterling stood perfectly still by the mahogany wet bar. He was impeccably dressed in a tailored charcoal suit, his tie flawlessly knotted, his silver-dusted hair swept back with immaculate precision. He poured exactly 2 fingers of Macallan 25 into a heavy crystal glass, his hand steady, entirely unbothered by the macabre scene unfolding in the center of his living room. Bound tightly to a reinforced steel chair placed meticulously atop a plastic drop cloth was Carlo, one of Victor's most trusted lieutenants. Carlo's face was heavily bruised, his right eye swollen shut, and a steady stream of blood dripped from his split lip onto his ruined silk shirt. He was panting heavily, his wide, terrified eyes locked on Victor's broad back. Victor picked up the glass, took a slow, appreciative sip of the scotch, and turned around. The expression on his face was terrifying. It wasn't the fiery, explosive rage of a volatile thug. It was a cold, glacial, absolute zero. It was the face of a king who had just watched his empire burn, and who had already calculated the exact mathematical equation required to drown the world in blood. "I have paid you incredibly well for 10 years. Carlo," Victor said, his voice softer than the jazz music playing in the background. He walked slowly toward the bound man, his footsteps making no sounds on the plush Persian rug beneath the plastic. "I paid for your daughter's tuition at Columbia. I bought your mother the house in Sicily. I gave you power, respect, and a seat at my table. Boss, Victor, please," Carlo choked out, coughing up a spatter of blood. Thorne said you were losing your mind. He said you were going to war with the feds over the accountant. He said Gaines was going to freeze everything. And so you gave Marcus Thorne the access codes to the syndicate's internal security grid, Victor stated, stating a fact rather than asking a question. He swirled the amber liquid in his glass, watching the light catch the crystal. "You allowed Thorne's loyalists to bypass my perimeter. You helped him fabricate the digital footprint that led Gaines directly to Clara the moment she stepped onto the street. We had to protect the family," Carlo screamed, tears of genuine panic streaming down his bruised face. "She was a liability. Victor Thorne made a deal with the DA. If we gave her up, Gaines took him back off the RICO charges." Victor stopped inches from the chair. He looked down at Carlo, his dark eyes entirely devoid of humanity. The very mention of Clara being handed over to Gaines of her brilliant, beautiful light being extinguished in a federal cage because of his own men's treachery ignited a supernova of violence within his chest. But Victor did not shout. He did not lose control. "You do not get to decide who is a liability in my empire," Victor whispered, setting his scotch glass down onto a nearby glass coffee table. He reached into the inner pocket of his suit jacket. "And you do not get to sell the woman I love to buy your own pathetic survival." Victor's hands moved with blinding, terrifying speed. He withdrew a specialized, braided steel garrote wire, the wooden handles slipping perfectly into his palms. In one fluid, unstoppable motion, he stepped behind Carlo, looped the wire over the traitor's head, and pulled it taut across his throat. Carlo's eyes bulged in absolute horror. His hands, zip-tied behind the chair, thrashed violently. The plastic drop cloth crinkled loudly under his kicking feet, but Victor's grip was a mechanical vice. He didn't yank the wire to decapitate the man. He applied a precise, sustained, crushing pressure, cutting off the carotid arteries and the windpipe simultaneously. Victor leaned in, his mouth right next to Carlo's ear, his voice a calm, soothing whisper over the desperate gurgling sounds of the dying man. "Tell Marcus I am coming," Victor murmured. Carlo's violent thrashing slowed. His eyes rolled back into his head. 30 seconds later, the lieutenant's body went completely limp, sagging heavily against the ropes. Victor held the pressure for another full minute, ensuring the traitor was entirely extinguished. Slowly, methodically, He released the handles, letting the bloody garrote wire fall to the plastic. Victor stepped back, adjusted his cuffs, and picked up his scotch glass. He drained the rest of the liquor, the burn grounding him. The jazz record spun to an end, the needle clicking rhythmically in the empty groove. The heavy oak doors of the penthouse opened. A dozen men stepped inside. These were not the tailored capos or the political strategists. These were Victor's ghosts, the apex predators of the Sterling Syndicate, former Special Forces operators, elite hitmen, whose loyalty was bought not with money, but with blood debts they owed directly to Victor. They were dressed in black tactical gear, armed with suppressed submachine guns and ceramic body armor. The leader of the squad, a towering man named Silas, looked at Carlo's corpse and then at Victor. "We traced the burner phone Carlo used to contact Thorne," Silas reported, his voice a low gravel. "It pinged off a cell tower in the Red Hook Industrial District, an abandoned marine warehouse. Thorne has a perimeter of 20 men, heavily armed." 20 men, Victor repeated softly. He walked over to a secure biometric gun safe built into the mahogany wall. He pressed his hand against the scanner. The heavy steel door popped open. Victor began removing his suit jacket, tossing it onto the sofa. Thorne thinks he has orchestrated a masterpiece. He thinks he has captured the queen and cornered the king. Victor pulled a black Kevlar vest over his crisp white shirt. He strapped a tactical holster to his thigh, sliding a customized, matte black Glock 19 into place. He checked the action on a suppressed MP5 submachine gun, the metallic clicks ringing out with lethal precision in the quiet room. "Silas," Victor said, turning to face his elite squad, his eyes burning with an apocalyptic wrath. "We are going to breach that warehouse. No negotiations, no survivors. You kill every man holding a weapon, but you leave Marcus Thorne alive for me." He paused, his gaze hardening into something mythical and terrifying. "And if a single bullet grazes Clara Hayes, I will burn this entire city to the bedrock." "Move out." The rain began to fall in heavy, freezing sheets over the Red Hook harbor, masking the sound of the matte black tactical vans rolling to a silent stop 2 blocks from the targeted warehouse. The area was a desolate graveyard of rusted shipping containers and broken cranes. Victor moved through the shadows with the lethal, fluid grace of a hunting panther. His squad fanned out, communicating entirely through hand signals and encrypted comms. The perimeter guards Thorne had stationed outside the warehouse were amateurs compared to Victor's ghosts. A guard smoking a cigarette near a loading dock didn't even have time to exhale before Silas materialized from the darkness behind him, snapping his neck with a brutal, silent twist. Another guard patrolling the roof was neutralized by a suppressed sniper round that hit him squarely in the temple, his body caught by a second operative before it could hit the gravel. Victor approached the heavy steel side entrance of the warehouse. He didn't feel the freezing rain. He didn't feel the weight of his armor. All he felt was the magnetic, desperate pull of the woman trapped inside. He placed a customized, shaped breaching charge against the electronic lock mechanism, stepped back, and nodded to Silas. The suppressed thwump of the charge blowing the lock was barely audible over the roaring storm. Victor kicked the door inward and entered the darkness. Inside the cavernous warehouse, Marcus Thorne was pacing around the halogen light, still gloating to the broken, weeping woman tied to the chair. Thorne's remaining venom, about 15 heavily armed thugs, were scattered around the perimeter of the light, laughing and smoking, entirely oblivious to the apex predators slipping into their airspace. "You see, Clara," Thorne was saying, his voice echoing off the corrugated steel roof. "The problem with brilliant women is that they always fall for the illusion of romance. Victor didn't care about your mind. He just wanted a pet, and when the pet got rabies, he put it down." Victor stepped out from behind a rusted forklift, raising his suppressed MP5. The violence was not a battle. It was a highly choreographed, one-sided slaughter. Victor and his squad opened fire simultaneously. The suppressed weapons spat a deadly hail of subsonic rounds into the warehouse. The distinct, rapid of the gunfire was immediately followed by the wet, sickening thuds of bodies hitting the concrete. Thorne's men dropped before they even realized they were under attack. Skulls shattered, chests caved in, weapons clattered to the floor unfired. In less than 10 seconds, 12 men were dead, their blood pooling rapidly on the dusty floor. Thorne screamed, spinning around, wildly firing his handgun into the darkness. A suppressed round from Silas's rifle shattered Thorne's right kneecap. Thorne shrieked in agony, his leg collapsing under him, sending him crashing to the concrete. His gun slid away across the floor. He desperately clawed at the ground, trying to crawl away from the halo of the work light into the shadows. A heavy, tactical boot stepped firmly onto Thorne's shattered knee, pinning him to the floor. Thorne screamed again, looking up into the cold, merciless face of Victor Sterling. Victor didn't look at the screaming traitor beneath his boot. His eyes immediately sought out the chair in the center of the light. Clara was slumped forward, bound by thick ropes, her beautiful hair tangled and matted with sweat. She was shaking violently, her eyes wide and traumatized, staring at the carnage unfolding around her. But when Victor stepped fully into the light, lowering his weapon, Clara didn't look at him with relief. She shrank back against the ropes. She looked at him with absolute, unadulterated terror. Victor's heart seized. The physical reaction was more violent than taking a bullet to the chest. He stepped off Thorne, ignoring the groaning man, and walked slowly toward the chair, slinging his rifle onto his back. "Clara," Victor whispered, his voice cracking, reaching his hands out toward her. "Clara, you're safe. I've got you. Don't touch me." Clara screamed, her voice hoarse, completely shattered. She thrashed against her bindings, trying desperately to get away from him. "Don't touch me. You sold me. You told him I was a liability. I heard you on the tape." Victor froze. The pieces clicked together with horrifying clarity. He looked at Thorne, who was writhing on the floor, laughing a wet, bloody laugh, an AI deepfake voice clone. Thorne choked out, coughing up blood. "I fed it hundreds of hours of your encrypted phone calls. She believed every word. She thinks you traded her to Gaines. I broke her. Victor, I broke your brilliant little equal." Victor's eyes darkened into an abyss. He drew his Glock 19 in a fraction of a second, aiming it down at Thorne. But as his finger tightened on the trigger, he stopped. He looked back at Clara. He saw the utter devastation in her eyes, the complete loss of her agency and her spirit. If he killed Thorne now, he would just be another violent man, asserting dominance in front of her. He needed to heal her. He needed to show her that she was not broken, and she was not his property. Victor holstered his weapon. He walked over to Clara, ignoring her flinching, and pulled a combat knife from his vest. With two swift cuts, he severed the thick ropes binding her wrists. Clara slumped forward, rubbing her bruised wrists, tears streaming down her face. Unable to look him in the eye, Victor knelt on the cold concrete directly in front of her. He reached out and gently, reverently, cupped her face in both of his hands, forcing her to look into his eyes. "Clara," Victor said, his voice entirely steady, vibrating with absolute, undeniable truth. "Listen to my voice, the real voice. Not a machine, not a recording. Look at me." Clara hiccuped a sob, her green eyes finding his dark ones, searching desperately for the lie. "I tore my own empire apart to find you," Victor whispered, his thumbs gently wiping the tears from her bruised cheeks. "I killed my own men. I walked into this warehouse ready to burn the world to ashes because you were in it. I did not sell you. I would rather die 1,000 agonizing deaths than let anyone put you in a cage." Clara stared at him, the wall of her despair beginning to crack, the truth of his presence, the warmth of his hands, overriding the cold perfection of the digital lie. "You are not a pawn to be traded, Clara," Victor said fiercely, his eyes burning with intense, unconditional respect. "You are not a liability. You are the only light in my dark, miserable existence. You are my equal." Victor slowly reached down to his thigh holster. He unclipped his customized Glock 19, pulled the slide back to chamber around, and held the weapon out to her, grip first. Clara looked at the heavy, lethal weapon in his hand, then back up at Victor's face. "I am not going to carry you out of here like a victim," Victor stated, his voice ringing with empowering authority. He pressed the gun into her trembling hands, closing her fingers around the grip. "You are Clara Hayes. You are the woman who brought a criminal empire to its knees with a laptop. You are brilliant. You are unbroken." Victor stood up, turning his back to Thorne, leaving the traitor entirely at Clara's mercy, placing absolute trust in her judgment. "Now," Victor said, holding his hand out to her, "pick up the gun, stand up, and let's take our lives back." The fire crackled softly in the massive stone hearth of the remote coastal safe house, casting a warm, flickering golden light over the heavy timber beams and the plush, oversized furniture. The rhythmic, hypnotic sound of the Atlantic Ocean crashing against the rugged cliffs outside served as a steady heartbeat to a world that had suddenly, blessedly, gone quiet. Victor Sterling knelt on the thick woolen rug, a basin of warm water beside him. He held Clara's bruised, raw wrists in his large hands with the reverence of a man holding something infinitely precious and painfully fragile. He leaned down, pressing a soft, lingering kiss to the angry red welts left by the zip ties. The touch was featherlight, a silent apology and a profound vow of protection, all wrapped into one fleeting contact. Clara sat on the edge of the leather sofa, a thick cashmere blanket draped over her shoulders. The adrenaline that had sustained her through the horrors of the federal holding cell and Marcus Thorne's psychological torture had completely evaporated, leaving her hollowed out and shivering. But as Victor tended to her wounds, meticulously applying an antiseptic ointment with agonizing care, the crushing ice in her chest began to thaw. She watched him, the most feared man in the New York underworld, a man who had just orchestrated a bloodbath without breaking a sweat, reduced to utter gentleness. The bespoke charcoal suit was gone, replaced by a simple black Henley that stretched tight across his broad shoulders. He looked exhausted, the silver at his temples catching the firelight. But his dark eyes were intensely focused entirely on her healing. "Does it hurt?" Victor murmured, his thumb lightly stroking the unbruised skin of her palm. "Only when I think about how close we came to losing everything," Clara whispered, her voice still raspy from screaming in the warehouse. She looked around the expansive living room of the safe house. It was situated on a desolate stretch of the Maine coastline, a property completely off the grid, owned by a labyrinth of dummy corporations that not even Robert Gaines could trace. It was built like a military bunker, reinforced with bulletproof glass and steel core doors. But it was decorated like a sanctuary. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, Clara felt the suffocating weight of the world lift from her shoulders. "Are we truly safe here, Victor?" Victor looked up, his eyes meeting hers with absolute, unwavering certainty. "There is no digital footprint tying me to this property. The capos believe I am currently in a secure bunker in upstate New York, orchestrating a counter-offensive against the district attorney. Silas and my most trusted operators are running interference in the city, creating false trails that will keep the feds chasing ghosts for weeks. No one knows we are here, Clara. Not Gaines, not the FBI, and not the syndicate." He set the medical supplies aside and shifted closer, his knees resting against hers. He reached up, gently brushing a tangled lock of auburn hair behind her ear. "When I heard the audio recording Thorne played for you," Victor said, his voice dropping to a raw, painful register. "When I saw the look in your eyes, I felt a kind of terror I didn't know existed. The thought of you believing, even for a fraction of a second, that I would trade your life for my freedom, it tore my soul to pieces." Clara leaned into his touch, closing her eyes as a rogue tear slipped down her cheek. "It was flawless, Victor. The cadence, the tone, the coldness in the voice. It sounded exactly like the man who ran the boardroom." She opened her eyes, looking deeply into his. "But it didn't sound like the man who kissed me in the hallway. It didn't sound like the man who begged me to take the passport and fly to Geneva. I should have known. I should have trusted what I knew in my heart, rather than what I heard with my ears. You were sitting in a freezing warehouse, bound to a chair, being tortured by a sociopath. Victor countered fiercely, his hands moving to frame her face. You survived. Clara, you held on until I could find you. That is the only thing that matters. The space between them vanished. Victor leaned in, pressing his lips to hers. It was not a kiss born of adrenaline or desperate passion. It was a slow, deep, devastatingly tender communion. It was the desperate clinging of two survivors who had crawled through hell and finally found the sunlight. Clara let out a soft, shuddering sigh, her hands coming up to grip his forearms, feeling the solid, grounding strength of him. She opened her mouth to him, tasting the scotch he had drank earlier, feeling the heat of his body radiating through her damp clothes. When they finally broke apart, Victor rested his forehead against hers, their breaths mingling in the quiet room. I am done with the syndicate, Clara. Victor whispered into the darkness between them, the confession carrying the weight of a tectonic shift. Clara pulled back slightly, her green eyes wide with shock. What, Victor? You are the Sterling Syndicate. It's your legacy. It's everything you've built. It's a graveyard. Victor corrected, his voice laced with decades of exhaustion. I built an empire on violence and intimidation to survive a world that wanted to crush me. But I don't want to merely survive anymore. I want to live. And I cannot live in a world where my existence puts a target on your back. He took her hands in his, kissing her knuckles. Once Silas neutralizes the immediate threats in the city, I am systematically dismantling the organization. I have enough legitimate, untraceable capital secreted away in Europe to fund a dozen lifetimes. We leave the country. We take new names. We buy a villa on the Amalfi Coast or a cabin in the Swiss Alps. We disappear. Together, Clara stared at him, her heart swelling with an overwhelming, agonizing love. This ruthless, terrifying king was offering to burn his own throne to the ground just to hold her hand in the daylight. I love you, Clara said, the words spilling from her lips with absolute, undeniable clarity. It was the first time she had said it out loud, free from the constraints of their professional boundaries and the constant threat of death. I love you, Victor, not the boss, not the kingpin, just you. Victor's breath caught in his throat. A slow, breathtaking smile broke across his face, transforming him entirely, stripping away the decades of darkness and leaving only a man profoundly, impossibly happy. I love you, Clara Hayes, he murmured, pulling her down onto the rug with him, wrapping his arms securely around her waist. And I swear on my life, the nightmare is over. Nobody is ever going to hurt you again. They lay together by the fire for hours, wrapped in the thick cashmere blanket, listening to the storm raging outside. The wind howled against the reinforced glass, but inside, it was warm and impossibly peaceful. Clara rested her head on his chest, listening to the steady, rhythmic thumping of his heart. She allowed herself to envision the future he had painted, a quiet life in Europe. No more ledgers, no more encrypted servers, no more looking over her shoulder. For the first time in 5 years, the brilliant forensic accountant stopped calculating the odds of her survival and simply allowed herself to exist. She drifted into a deep, dreamless sleep, anchored by the heavy, protective weight of Victor's arms around her. The fire burned down to glowing red embers. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed 3 a.m. Suddenly, Victor's eyes snapped open in the darkness. He didn't move. He didn't breathe. His decades of combat instinct, honed in the bloodiest gang wars on the eastern seaboard, flared to life with terrifying urgency. Something was wrong. The ambient noise of the house was identical, but the atmosphere had shifted. It was a primal, imperceptible change in air pressure, the kind that precedes a catastrophic detonation. He slowly, carefully slid his arm from beneath Clara, who stirred softly but remained asleep. He sat up on his knees, his eyes scanning the pitch-black living room. The storm was still raging outside, rain lashing against the glass. Then he saw it. 3 tiny, brilliant red dots appeared on the far wall of the living room. They were completely silent, cutting through the darkness with mathematical precision. They tracked slowly across the framed paintings, moving with deliberate, coordinated lethal intent. Laser sights. Victor's blood ran to absolute zero. These were not syndicate hitmen. Mobsters used shotguns and cheap pistols. They wanted to send a loud message. Suppressed laser-designated rifles meant private military contractors. A highly trained, heavily armed mercenary hit squad. Robert Gaines hadn't sent the police to arrest them. The corrupt district attorney had used his black budget connections to hire an off-the-books death squad to eradicate the only 2 people who could expose his empire. One of the red dots slid off the wall and tracked silently across the floor, climbing up the edge of the leather sofa and coming to rest squarely in the center of Clara's sleeping chest. "Clara, get down," Victor roared, his voice shattering the peaceful silence of the safe house as he threw his entire massive body over hers. The front door of the safe house did not just open. It exploded inward with the catastrophic force of a heavy breaching charge. The deafening, concussive boom ripped through the living room, instantly blowing out the heavy timber framing and sending a lethal shower of splintered wood, twisted metal, and shattered glass flying across the room. The shockwave hit Victor like a physical blow, driving the breath from his lungs as he pinned Clara to the floor beneath the heavy oak coffee table. Before the dust could even begin to settle, a blinding white light erupted in the center of the room, followed immediately by a second, ear-splitting detonation. Flashbangs. Clara screamed, clutching her hands over her ears as her vision whited out entirely. A high-pitched, agonizing ringing pierced her eardrums, completely disorienting her. She was plunged into a nightmare of smoke, pulverized drywall, and absolute chaos. She could feel Victor moving above her, his heavy, protective weight shifting as he reacted with terrifying speed. "Stay under the table. Do not move," Victor bellowed, his voice barely audible over the ringing in her ears. Through the thick, choking smoke, Clara saw the horrifying silhouettes of at least 8 men pouring through the destroyed entryway. They moved with terrifying, fluid synchronization tactical operators in full ballistic armor, wearing night vision goggles and wielding suppressed, short-barreled assault rifles. They were sweeping the room with sweeping arcs of red laser light, executing a flawless, military-grade killhouse routine. Victor rolled out from beneath the table, drawing the customized Glock 19 from his hip. He didn't fire blindly. He engaged with the cold, calculated precision of an apex predator defending its mate. Crack, crack. The 2 rapid, unsuppressed shots from Victor's pistol echoed like cannon fire. The lead mercenary's head snapped back, his night vision goggles shattering as he crumpled dead to the floor. The second mercenary took a round directly to the throat, choking on his own blood as he collapsed against the ruined doorframe. "Contact front. Suppressing fire," one of the mercenaries barked. The living room instantly disintegrated into an apocalyptic storm of flying lead. The mercenaries opened fire simultaneously, their suppressed rifles spitting a relentless, terrifying hail of 5.56 subsonic rounds. The heavy leather sofa was shredded into confetti. The stone fireplace shattered, sending lethal shrapnel flying in every direction. Victor dove behind a massive, reinforced concrete pillar that supported the vaulted ceiling, returning fire with lethal accuracy, dropping a third operator with a clean shot to the chest cavity. But Victor was armed with a handgun, and they were armed with automatic rifles. He was heavily outgunned, and the element of surprise was gone. Clara lay flat against the floor, her heart hammering against her ribs so violently she thought it might break through her chest. The air was thick with the acrid, burning smell of cordite and copper. She coughed, dust coating her lungs, her eyes watering from the smoke. She watched Victor, a solitary titan standing between her and absolute destruction, moving with a desperate, feral intensity. He dropped an empty magazine and slammed a fresh one into his Glock in a fraction of a second, never taking his eyes off the fatal funnel of the hallway. "Flank him," a mercenary shouted. "Two men round the back terrace. Flush him out." Victor heard the command. He knew the structural layout of the safe house intimately. If they breached the glass doors of the terrace, he and Clara would be caught in an inescapable crossfire. "Clara," Victor yelled, firing two suppression shots down the hall to force the advancing mercenaries into cover. "The panic room in the basement. The access panel is behind the bookshelf. Go now." Clara scrambled out from under the splintered ruins of the coffee table, staying incredibly low to the ground. She low-crawled over the glass-strewn floor, her knees and elbows scraping against the debris. She reached the massive mahogany bookshelf on the far wall. Her fingers, usually typing flawless lines of code, desperately fumbled for the hidden latch Victor had shown her hours earlier. She found the recessed button and pushed, with a heavy mechanical grind. The bookshelf swung outward, revealing a narrow, descending concrete staircase. "Victor, it's open," Clara screamed, turning back toward him. At that exact moment, the reinforced glass doors of the terrace shattered inward under a barrage of automatic gunfire. Two mercenaries stepped into the living room from the flank, their sights sweeping directly toward the bookshelf. They saw Clara. Victor didn't hesitate. He didn't think. He abandoned the reinforced cover of the concrete pillar and threw his entire body across the open expanse of the living room, placing himself squarely between the flanking mercenaries and Clara. He raised his weapon, firing 3 rapid shots, dropping one of the flanking operators instantly. But the second mercenary squeezed his trigger. The suppressed rifle spat fire. Clara watched in horrifying, slow-motion clarity as Victor's body jerked violently. Thwack, thwack. The sound of the high-caliber rounds impacting human flesh was sickeningly dense. Victor took the first round directly in the lower abdomen, the kinetic force spinning him slightly. The second round caught him high in the right shoulder, shattering the collarbone and sending his Glock flying from his grip. Victor collapsed to his knees, a sharp, ragged gasp escaping his lips, blood instantly blossoming across the black fabric of his shirt. "No," Clara shrieked, a sound of pure, unadulterated agony tearing from her throat. The remaining mercenary on the terrace adjusted his aim, placing the red laser dot squarely on the back of Victor's head to finish the execution. Clara didn't freeze. The brilliant forensic accountant didn't wait for a hero. She became one. She lunged forward, grabbing a heavy, jagged piece of the shattered stone fireplace from the floor, with a primal screams of rage. She hurled it with all her strength at the mercenary. The heavy stone struck the man directly in the faceplate of his tactical helmet, shattering his night vision goggles and throwing his aim wildly off course as his rifle discharged into the ceiling. Before the mercenary could recover, Clara grabbed Victor by the collar of his tactical vest. Adrenaline, fueled by absolute terror and profound love, flooded her system, granting her a hysterical strength. She dragged the heavy, bleeding kingpin backward, hauling him through the concealed doorway just as the hallway mercenaries broke from their cover and opened fire. Bullets chewed through the mahogany bookshelf, raining splinters down on them as Clara slammed her hand against the interior control panel. The heavy, steel-reinforced door slammed shut, the deadbolts engaging with a massive, impenetrable metallic thud. They were plunged into the dimly lit, suffocating silence of the concrete stairwell. Victor, Clara sobbed, dropping to her knees beside him. She pressed her hands frantically against his chest, trying to stem the catastrophic flow of blood. His black shirt was soaked, hot and sticky beneath her trembling fingers. He was breathing in shallow, ragged gasps, his face pale and covered in sweat. "Clara," Victor coughed, a thin line of blood trickling from the corner of his mouth. "You have to. Leave me. The tunnel leads to the hidden garage. Take the armored car. Go, I am not leaving you." Clara screamed, her voice echoing in the concrete shaft. She tore off her cashmere blanket and began aggressively packing the thick wool directly into the gaping wound in his abdomen, pressing down with all her weight. You saved me. You took those bullets for me. You are not dying in this basement. Victor Sterling, do you hear me? Victor let out a low groan of agony, but his hand came up, his bloody fingers weakly gripping her wrist. They have breaching charges. They will blow the door in minutes. You can't carry me. I'm dead weight. I am a forensic accountant. Victor, Clara said, tears streaming down her face, her eyes burning with a fierce, unbreakable defiance. I specialize in carrying dead weight and making the impossible balance. Now shut up and help me stand you up. She dragged him upright, wrapping his uninjured left arm over her shoulder. Victor grit his teeth, forcing his failing legs to move, driven entirely by his desperate need to get her to safety. Together they stumbled down the steep concrete stairs, leaving a horrific trail of smeared blood on the gray walls. Every step was an agony. A frantic race against the muffled sounds of explosives being planted on the heavy steel door above them. They reached the bottom of the stairwell and entered a long, damp subterranean tunnel illuminated by flickering emergency lights. The air smelled of earth and old concrete. Clara practically carried him the last 50 yards, her lungs burning, her muscles screaming in protest. They reached the heavy metal door at the end of the tunnel. Clara pushed it open, stumbling into the hidden underground garage. Sitting in the center of the concrete bay was a massive, matte black armored Mercedes G-Wagon. It was a rolling fortress, equipped with bulletproof glass and run-flat tires. It was their salvation. The keys Victor rasped, slumping heavily against the side of the vehicle, clutching his bleeding abdomen. In the ignition, Clara opened the heavy passenger door and desperately shoved Victor into the seat. He fell back against the leather, his eyes rolling back, his breathing becoming alarmingly shallow. Clara slammed the door shut and sprinted around the front of the vehicle to the driver's side. She threw herself into the driver's seat, her hands coated in Victor's blood, slipping wildly on the steering wheel. She reached forward and twisted the key in the ignition. Click. Nothing happened. Clara froze. She twisted the key again. Harder this time. Click, click, click. The engine didn't even attempt to turn over. The dashboard remained completely dark. No, no, Clara sobbed, slapping the steering wheel in sheer panic. Start, please. God, start. Suddenly, a blinding spotlight flooded the underground garage from the exterior access ramp. The heavy, reinforced garage doors at the top of the ramp had been blown open. Standing at the top of the ramp, silhouetted by the harsh light, were 3 mercenaries. One of them stepped forward, holding a heavy, belt-fed light machine gun. He didn't aim at the bulletproof glass of the windshield. He aimed directly down at the grill of the G-Wagon. The mercenary opened fire. The deafening roar of the machine gun filled the garage. Heavy, armor-piercing rounds slammed into the hood of the Mercedes, shredding the metal like tin foil. The bullets tore through the radiator, shattered the engine block, and severed the main battery cables. Steam and thick, black smoke erupted from the destroyed engine bay, hissing violently in the cold air. The vehicle shuddered violently under the impact, entirely dead, entirely immobilized. The mercenaries ceased fire, keeping their weapons trained on the smoking, ruined vehicle. They weren't moving in. They were waiting. Clara sat in the driver's seat, staring through the cracked, spider-webbed bulletproof glass at the destroyed engine. The absolute, crushing finality of the moment settled over her like a shroud. The safe house was gone. The escape route was destroyed. She turned her head slowly. Victor was slumped against the passenger window. His skin was the color of ash. The blood had completely saturated the makeshift bandages and was pooling darkly on the black leather seat. His eyes were closed, his chest barely rising. Victor, Clara whispered, her voice breaking entirely. She reached out, her trembling, blood-soaked hands gently cupping his cold face. Victor, stay with me, please. The console radio in the dashboard suddenly crackled to life, bypassing the destroyed engine battery, powered by a hidden, Encrypted emergency backup. Good evening, Clara, a smooth, impeccably calm voice echoed through the speakers of the ruined car. It was District Attorney Robert Gaines. I must say, your tenacity is admirable. Gaines continued, his voice dripping with sadistic amusement over the secure channel. But I told you, Clara, you can't beat the system. You can't outrun me. I have frozen every single one of Victor's offshore medical funds. I have locked down every private clinic within 200 miles. You have no money. You have no transport. And based on the thermal imaging my men are feeding me, Victor Sterling has about 10 minutes left before he bleeds to death. Clara stared at the radio, her vision blurring with tears of absolute, profound despair. They were trapped in a concrete box, surrounded by heavily armed killers. With the man she loved dying in her arms, the triad of ruin was complete. They had survived the blast. They had survived the bullets. But they could not survive the sheer, overwhelming power of a corrupt empire that held all the cards. What do you want? Clara choked out, leaning her forehead against Victor's cold shoulder, sobbing into the dark fabric of his vest. Please, God. Robert, what do you want? I want exactly what I asked for in the interrogation room, Gaines replied coldly. I want you to sign a full, physical confession taking the fall for the Sterling Syndicate. I want your life, Clara, and if you give it to me, I will order my men to call a medical evacuation helicopter for Mr. Sterling right now. The choice is yours, freedom or his life. You have 60 seconds to decide before my men execute you both. The digital clock on the G-Wagon's ruined dashboard, powered by the isolated emergency battery, blinked with agonizing indifference. 45 seconds. The freezing air rushing in through the bullet-shattered windshield carried the sharp, metallic stench of fresh blood and destroyed machinery. Clara Hayes kept her hands pressed fiercely against the catastrophic wound in Victor Sterling's abdomen, her own blood-soaked fingers slipping against the Kevlar and torn fabric. Beneath her hands, the terrifyingly faint flutter of his heartbeat was slowing, a fading drumbeat echoing the collapse of her entire world. 30 seconds, Clara. District Attorney Robert Gaines's voice crackled through the encrypted radio channel, smooth, unhurried, and dripping with absolute malice. My men are authorized to deploy incendiary grenades into the vehicle if you do not comply. Mr. Sterling will not simply bleed to death. He will burn. Make your choice. Clara looked down at the man who had torn his own empire apart to save her. Victor's eyes fluttered open, dark and glassy with shock. He forced a bloody, trembling hand up, his fingers wrapping weakly around her wrist, trying to pull her hands away from his wound. He was dying, his body shutting down from massive blood loss, yet his fierce, unwavering instinct to protect her remained absolute. No, Victor rasped, a bloody bubble bursting at the corner of his lips. Every syllable was an agony that tore through his shattered collarbone. Clara, don't do it. Let them kill me. Do not give him your freedom. I won't allow it. Tears streamed down Clara's ash-streaked face, dropping onto Victor's chest. She leaned down, pressing her forehead against his, her sobs shaking her entire frame. He had given her back her dignity. He had looked at her, a disgraced, broken woman, and called her his equal. He had walked into a hail of bullets because a world without her in it was a world he refused to inhabit. She could not let his magnificent, fierce light be extinguished in a cold, concrete basement. She loved him too much to let him die for her pride. I love you, Victor, Clara whispered against his lips, her voice breaking into 1,000 shattered pieces. But I am not leaving this world without you in it. Clara lifted her head, her green eyes hardening into chips of emerald ice. She reached out and grabbed the emergency radio microphone from the dashboard, her blood-slicked thumb pressing the transmission button. I accept your terms, Clara said, her voice completely devoid of emotion, a dead, hollow sound that sealed her fate. Call the medevac. If he dies, Gaines, I swear to God I will bleed you dry in federal court. A wise decision, Ms. Hayes, Gaines replied, the sickening smile evident in his voice. Stand down, boys, secure the package. The blinding spotlight at the top of the ramp shifted. The tactical mercenaries swarmed the ruined vehicle, ripping the passenger door open. Clara fought them, screaming, as rough hands grabbed her by the shoulders and violently dragged her out of the driver's seat. She was thrown to the concrete floor, heavy boots pinning her down as zip ties were brutally tightened around her wrists. She could only watch in helpless, agonizing terror as combat medics dragged Victor's limp, bleeding body from the G-Wagon, loading him onto a tactical stretcher. Within minutes, the deafening roar of a medical evacuation helicopter echoed outside the underground garage. They loaded Victor in, and the chopper lifted off, disappearing into the raging storm. Clara was hauled to her feet and shoved into the back of a black Federal SUV. The journey back to New York City was a blur of trauma and sensory deprivation. She sat in the darkness, shivering violently in her blood-soaked clothes, the metallic taste of absolute defeat coating her tongue. She had traded her hard-fought autonomy, her brilliance, and her entire future to save a single life. The psychological devastation of this surrender was a crushing physical weight, compressing her lungs until she could barely draw breath. The system had won. Evil had won. Hours later, the SUV pulled into the secure subterranean garage of the New York County District Attorney's Office. Clara was dragged through a labyrinth of sterile, fluorescent-lit corridors and shoved into Robert Gaines's private, sprawling corner office. The contrast was sickening. Clara stood in the center of the room, her hair matted with concrete dust, her clothes stiff with Victor's dried blood. The office, however, was a temple of immaculate, untouched corruption. It smelled of expensive mahogany, leather bindings, and peppermint. Gaines sat behind a massive, pristine desk, sipping an espresso, looking at her with the triumphant, detached curiosity of an entomologist pinning a rare butterfly to a corkboard. Please, sit, Clara. Gaines gestured to a plush leather chair opposite his desk. Clara did not move. Where is he? Is he alive? Mr. Sterling is currently in a secure, off-the-books surgical suite, receiving the finest medical care black money can buy. Gaines said smoothly, he is stabilized. He will live to spend the rest of his life in a supermax medical wing, provided you fulfill your end of the bargain. Gaines stood up, picked up a thick, 50-page legal document, and dropped it onto the desk in front of the empty chair. This is a comprehensive, physical confession, Gaines explained. Tapping the paper, it details exactly how you, Clara Hayes, orchestrated the financial structure of the Sterling Syndicate. It admits that you hacked my mother's accounts to frame me as a distraction from your own RICO violations. But there is a blank section on page 42. To make this ironclad in a federal court, I need you to manually type in the exact offshore routing numbers and cryptographic keys you used to access the syndicate's Cayman accounts. Only you know them. Once you type them in and sign the bottom line, the deal is struck. He gestured to an isolated, secure laptop sitting on the edge of the desk, already open to the digital file of the confession. Clara looked at the laptop, then at the physical paper. This was the moment of absolute capitulation. If she typed those numbers, she would provide the final, irrefutable puzzle piece. Gaines needed to lock her away forever and seize Victor's assets for his own political war chest. She was completely powerless. With slow, trembling steps, Clara walked toward the desk. She sat in the leather chair, pulling the laptop toward her zip-tied hands. Gaines signaled his guard, who stepped forward and snipped the plastic bindings, allowing her to type. Clarissa placed her fingers on the keyboard. For a fleeting second, she closed her eyes, remembering the warmth of Victor's hands framing her face, telling her she was his equal. She opened her eyes, staring at the blinding white screen of the document. Her fingers began to move. She typed the offshore routing numbers, the Swiss account codes, the encrypted server IPs. She formatted the document with flawless, bureaucratic precision, ensuring every legal parameter was met. Done, Clara whispered, her voice hollow. Gaines smiled, stepping forward to hit the print command. The heavy laser printer in the corner whirred to life, spitting out the finalized 50-page death warrant. Gaines took the fresh pages, aligned them perfectly, and placed them in front of her along with an expensive fountain pen. "Sign it, Clara," Gaines ordered softly. "And let's put this ugly chapter behind us." Clara picked up the heavy gold pen. Her hand shook so violently she could barely grip the metal. She looked at the signature line. Clara Hayes. The name of a woman who had fought so hard to reclaim her dignity, now willingly signing it away to a monster. Tears of absolute, crushing defeat spilled over her eyelashes, dropping onto the pristine paper, blurring the black ink. She traded her soul, her freedom, and her basic human rights, entirely crushed beneath the boot of systemic injustice. She pressed the nib to the paper and signed her name. Gaines snatched the document away the second the pen lifted. He checked the signature, a terrifying grin stretching across his face. "Excellent. You see, Clara, the world operates on leverage. I had it. You didn't. Take her to the federal detention center. Put her in solitary confinement until her sentencing hearing." Guards grabbed Clara roughly, pulling her away from the desk. She didn't fight them. Her eyes remained fixed on the floor, her spirit entirely pulverized. A brilliant mind locked forever in the dark. 3 weeks later, the air inside the Federal District Court of the Southern District of New York was stifling, thick with the heavy, suffocating theater of inevitable doom. Clara Hayes sat at the defense table, her wrists bound in heavy steel shackles attached to a chain around her waist. She wore an oversized, faded orange jumpsuit that swallowed her thin frame. The deep circles under her eyes spoke of weeks spent in absolute, lightless isolation. She stared blankly at the polished mahogany grain of the table, emotionally anesthetized, waiting for the gavel to fall and end her life. The courtroom was packed to capacity. Reporters from every major news network crammed the wooden benches, their pens poised to record the downfall of the syndicate's queen. At the prosecution table sat District Attorney Robert Gaines. He was practically vibrating with victorious energy, dressed in a bespoke navy suit, whispering smugly to his team of assistant prosecutors. This was his crowning moment. This conviction would secure his run for the governor's office, built entirely on the ashes of Clara's life. "All rise," the court bailiff bellowed as the Honorable Judge Thomas Harrison took the bench. "Be seated," Judge Harrison commanded, adjusting his spectacles as he looked down at the docket. "We are here for the sentencing of Clara Hayes, who has pled guilty to 22 counts of federal racketeering, wire fraud, and conspiracy. Mr. Gaines, the prosecution has submitted a signed, physical confession outlining the defendant's total complicity. Do you wish to enter this document into the official, sealed federal court record at this time?" Gaines stood up, buttoning his jacket with a flourish. "Yes, Your Honor." The prosecution requests that the physical confession be scanned and entered into the Centralized Department of Justice database as Exhibit A, sealing the defendant's guilt for the public record. "Very well." The judge nodded. "The court clerk will scan the document." A young court clerk took the thick, 50-page confession from Gaines's assistant. She walked over to the secure, high-speed digital scanner attached to the court stenographer's federal terminal. She placed the stack of papers into the feed tray and pressed the glowing green button. Where, click, were, the pages began to pull through the machine, converting the physical document into a digital PDF, uploading it directly into the heavily encrypted, centralized servers of the United States federal justice system. At the defense table, Clara Hayes slowly lifted her head. The hollow, defeated look in her green eyes vanished, replaced instantly by the cold, calculating brilliance of a forensic apex predator. Her heart began to hammer a frantic, exhilarating rhythm against her ribs. A forensic accountant did not need bullets to win a war. She just needed a single line of malicious code. When Clara had sat at Gaines's computer 3 weeks ago in his office, typing her offshore routing numbers into the confession, she hadn't just formatted the document. With a typing speed that bordered on the superhuman, She had secretly embedded a highly sophisticated, self-executing digital Trojan horse, a macro virus, into the metadata of the PDF file. The physical pages meant nothing. The trap was the digital file living on Gaines's hard drive, waiting to be officially uploaded to a networked federal server. The scanner pulled the final page containing her tear-stained signature through the feed. The clerk looked at her computer monitor. Document scanned and uploaded to the federal docket. "Your Honor, thank you," Judge Harrison said, picking up his gavel. "Ms. Hayes, before I sentence you to a mandatory term of life in a federal penitentiary without the possibility of..." The judge's microphone suddenly cut out with a deafening screech of digital feedback. The massive, 80-inch digital evidence monitors mounted on the walls of the courtroom flickered violently. The federal seal of the Department of Justice vanished from the screens, placed by a cascading waterfall of green, highly encrypted code. "What is the meaning of this?" Judge Harrison demanded, banging his gavel. "Bailiff, secure the AV system." Gaines frowned, looking back at his assistants. "Shut the screens off." "It's a glitch." But it wasn't a glitch. The Trojan horse Clara had embedded had executed flawlessly the second it touched the federal server. It rapidly bypassed the court's firewalls and immediately initiated a mass extraction protocol aimed directly at the IP addresses belonging to District Attorney Robert Gaines. The green code on the massive screen snapped away, replaced by a crystal clear, high-definition spreadsheet. Gasps erupted from the gallery of reporters. Displayed in massive font for the entire courtroom to see were the private, heavily encrypted, offshore banking ledgers of Robert Gaines. Every illicit wire transfer, every bribe taken from rival cartels, every cent of the $40 million he had stolen and laundered through Belize, was scrolling rapidly down the screens, next to the ledgers. Time-stamped emails between Gaines and the mercenary commanders who had blown up the safe house were displayed in full text. "Shut it down," Gaines roared, panic finally shattering his immaculate facade as he lunged toward the clerk's terminal. "Cut the power. Cut the main breaker." But the digital guillotine had already fallen. Clara's virus wasn't just displaying the evidence in the courtroom. It was currently live-streaming the entire cache of Gaines's corruption directly to the secure servers of the FBI director, the IRS Criminal Investigations Division, and the inbox of every major investigative journalist sitting in the gallery. Every phone in the courtroom began to buzz and chime simultaneously as breaking news alerts hit the network. Then, the final nail in the coffin echoed through the courtroom's speakers. "Gaines wants the Hayes woman." The audio recording of Marcus Thorne played, booming through the speakers. "He needs a scapegoat for the RICO indictments. You signed the internal transfer of power to me. And Gaines unfreezes your legitimate port authorities." Gaines stood frozen in the center of the courtroom, his face entirely drained of blood. The absolute, irrefutable proof of his crimes, his collusion with the mob, and his weaponization of the justice system was bare for the world to see. Suddenly, the heavy oak doors at the back of the courtroom were kicked open with a resounding, echoing crash. The entire gallery spun around. Standing in the doorway was Victor Sterling. He was not wearing handcuffs. He was not a prisoner. He leaned heavily on a black cane, his right arm in a sling, pale from the catastrophic injuries he had sustained. But he radiated an aura of absolute, terrifying power. He was flanked not by syndicate enforcers, but by 4 high-ranking special agents of the FBI. Victor looked across the chaotic courtroom, his dark eyes locking instantly with Clara's. The profound, overwhelming relief and love that passed between them in that single, silent look was enough to shatter the very foundations of the building. District Attorney Robert Gaines, the lead FBI agent, barked, stepping past Victor and marching down the center aisle, flashing a federal warrant. "You are under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder, federal racketeering, embezzlement, and the abuse of public office. Put your hands behind your back." Gaines stumbled backward, hitting the prosecution table. "This is fabricated. It's a mob hit. That man is Victor Sterling. He's the head of the syndicate, Mr. Sterling." the FBI agent stated coldly as he violently slapped handcuffs onto Gaines's wrists, is a federally protected state witness. He has spent the last 3 weeks brokering a full blanket immunity deal with the Department of Justice in exchange for turning over the operational structure of his former syndicate and providing the physical terminal required to decrypt the evidence currently playing on those screens. Victor walked slowly down the aisle, his eyes never leaving Clara. The guards who had been standing over her quickly stepped back, entirely intimidated by his presence. Victor stopped at the defense table. He didn't say a word. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a small steel key the FBI had given him, and knelt in front of her. With a sharp click, the heavy steel shackles fell from Clara's wrists. Clara gasped, rubbing her bruised skin. She stood up, her legs trembling. She looked up at the towering, battered man who had burned his world to the ground to keep her safe. She threw her arms carefully around his neck, burying her face into his uninjured shoulder, sobbing tears of absolute, unfiltered joy. Victor dropped his cane, wrapping his good arm tightly around her waist, burying his face in her auburn hair, breathing her in as if she were oxygen itself. "You did it," Victor whispered fiercely against her temple, ignoring the chaos of Gaines being dragged out of the courtroom by federal agents. "You brilliant, terrifying woman. You brought the entire corrupt system to its knees." Clara pulled back just enough to look into his dark eyes, a fierce, beautiful smile breaking through her tears. "I had a little help from a man who refused to let me die in the dark." 6 months later, the crisp, cool wind coming off Lake Geneva ruffled Clara's auburn hair as she stood on the expansive glass balcony of a towering, modern office building. The view of the Swiss Alps was breathtaking, the snow-capped peaks glittering in the brilliant afternoon sunlight. She was dressed in a stunning, tailored emerald green suit, holding a steaming cup of coffee, looking out at a world that finally belonged to her. Behind her, the heavy glass doors slid open. Victor stepped onto the balcony, moving with his old, silent grace, the cane entirely discarded. He slipped his arms around her waist from behind, pulling her back against his solid chest, resting his chin on the top of her head. "The final wire transfers cleared this morning," Victor murmured, his voice a soothing rumble against her back. "The Sterling Syndicate is officially, financially dissolved. The remaining assets have been legally liquidated and funneled into the firm." Clara smiled, leaning back into his embrace. They had not run away to hide in the shadows. They had taken the ruins of their pasts and forged them into a weapon for the innocent. Their new firm, Hayes and Sterling Legal Advocacy, was now the most well-funded, ruthlessly efficient legal aid and forensic accounting firm in Europe, dedicated entirely to protecting whistleblowers, exposing corporate corruption, and defending those who were being crushed by the very systems meant to protect them. Gaines was officially denied bail today, Clara noted, watching a sailboat drift across the pristine blue water of the lake. "He's going to spend the rest of his life in a supermax facility, the exact same concrete box he tried to put me in." Victor turned her gently in his arms, looking down at her with a reverence that had only deepened over the passing months. "You didn't just save my life in that basement, Clara," he said softly, his thumbs tracing the line of her jaw. "You saved my humanity. You showed me that true power isn't about controlling people through fear. It's about respecting their dignity." Clara reached up, framing his handsome, scarred face with her hands. She looked at the man who had treated her as an equal when the rest of the world viewed her as a commodity. "We saved each other, Victor," Clara whispered, rising onto her toes to meet his lips. "Because nobody belongs in the shadows forever. And true power is having the strength to pull the people you love into the light." They kissed under the bright Swiss sun, equals in every measure. Two unbroken survivors who had conquered the darkness and finally claimed their right to exist in the beautiful, unyielding daylight. As we reach the conclusion of Clara and Victor's journey, it is essential to step back and reflect on the profound truths hidden beneath the surface of this intense mafia drama. At its core, This is not merely a story about a crime syndicate and a high stakes romance. It is a raw, unyielding exploration of human dignity, true equality, and the fierce reclamation of self worth in the face of systemic abuse. We often live in a world that tries to categorize us, where corrupt systems and arrogant individuals attempt to dictate our value based on their own selfish agendas. District Attorney Robert Gaines represents the very real, terrifying reality of institutional power used to crush the innocent, viewing human lives as disposable commodities and stepping stones for personal ambition. But Clara Hayes stands as a brilliant testament to the fact that your worth is never determined by the cage someone else tries to force you into. She was stripped of her career, her reputation, and her physical freedom. Yet she never allowed the world to strip away her intellect, her resilience, or her integrity. Her journey teaches us that true strength does not require a weapon or a loud voice. It requires an unbreakable belief in your own agency and the courage to use your mind as your greatest defense. When she brought an empire to its knees with a single line of code, she proved that knowledge and truth are the ultimate equalizers against brute force. Furthermore, this narrative fundamentally redefines the concept of love, power, and protection. Victor Sterling, despite operating in a ruthless and violent environment, possessed an inherent honor that the legitimate authorities utterly lacked. Through him, we learn that true love is never about ownership, control, or locking someone in a gilded cage just to keep them safe. True love, the kind of love that heals deep trauma and empowers the soul, is about standing shoulder to shoulder with your partner as an absolute equal. It is about recognizing their brilliance, handing them the power to defend themselves, and respecting their autonomy above your own selfish desires. When Victor looked at Clara and saw a sovereign equal rather than a subordinate, and when Clara used her unique brilliance to save him in return, they demonstrated that a true partnership amplifies the strength of both individuals. The ultimate lesson this story offers is that no matter how dark your circumstances may seem, and no matter how profoundly you have been broken by a cruel world, you always possess the power to rise from the ashes. You are not a pawn. You are not a liability. And you are never truly powerless as long as you hold firmly onto your dignity and your truth. This content is manually researched, constructed, and edited by us to bring meaning and educational value.